Hello, everyone. Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talisse.
I'm Scott Aikin.
We are the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. And this is the third of three, we think, episodes of the video series here that have to do with themes that are arising out of a book that we're currently working on, which is titled Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy, which should be out...
Modestly titled.
Yeah. It's titled The Critique of Pure Reason. Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy, I guess should be out early in the next calendar year, early in 2018. Where we left off last time was with the big reveal that precisely the reason why we think that one who is a pragmatist should embrace analytic pragmatism is because analytic pragmatism keeps a certain range of skeptical concerns on the table. That looks like it puts us at great odds, not only with contemporary classical, self-styled contemporary classical pragmatists, that is, contemporary philosophers who ally themselves, ally themselves with figures and books that are over 100 years old, because that's how forward-looking they are. Puts us at odds with a certain range of contemporary classical pragmatists who think that what pragmatism is not even anti-skepticism. It's the refusal to take skeptical challenges as philosophical challenges or as properly laid philosophical cards on a table. What we want to talk about now then is in what regard, let's say two things on the agenda.
Yeah.
In what sense should we say that analytic pragmatism is not in what sense should we say that analytic pragmatism leaves some skeptical challenges standing? Second item on the agenda, why would one think that that's good news for that kind of pragmatism rather than the reductio, which it often is expressed as, right? That is to say that the anti-analytic pro-pragmatist line is often that analytic pragmatism leaves skeptical problems on the table as philosophical concerns, therefore it's not really pragmatist, and therefore it's not really viable. That sounds like a bunch of non sequiturs, which it is, but...
we can at least see the reasoning.
Yeah,
there,
good.
Right, so we can see that there's reasoning. Whether or not it's good is another issue.
Yeah.
Again, maybe even one more contrast is just to say that a good deal of the pragmatist program is a redescription of philosophical issues. And Dewey even very famously said the reconstruction in philosophy essay should have been retitled Reconstruction of Philosophy. And that it's a kind of reorientation so that once you see certain kinds of problems under these descriptions, you no longer feel compelled to try to solve them. And by the way, that kind of orientation is one that's similar to the common sense tradition, effectively just saying something like maybe the best response to a good deal of philosophical positions is to just guffaw in their face or to raise one's voice with them or something along these lines.
Hume. I mean, this is a Humean idea.
That's right.
It's not at all, although it's presented by the classical pragmatists as if it's a brand new idea that they came up with because they're so radical and innovative. It's as old as philosophy itself.
It's too bad that they didn't. And right, it's not just Hume. Cicero's got versions of this. Diogenes Laertius tells silly stories about the skeptics, and treats them as though he's reduced Pyrrho to absurdity because he acted in a silly way about dogs chasing him up a tree and so on. So these sorts of practical replies to the two high philosophical programs is one that's a very old one, and one that, again, the pragmatists didn't invent. But why is it that why is it that skeptical and other kinds of high philosophical questions arise once we've adopted the analytic pragmatist perspective? The first one is just that you might say the problem of disagreement is a serious one, and one that I think the pragmatists need to be able to handle much better than, in fact, they do. And so this is a place where, in fact, metaphilosophical disagreement, where you need to be able to look across the table at somebody who's read all the articles that you have, and you could say, well, look, I've got this view because of the fact that you just don't know how to read Kant, or you've got that view because you just forgot to read that bit of Aristotle's Organon, or you didn't read all the way to the end of Dewey's Experience in Nature. Nobody here, it's not amateur hour in philosophy. We're all good scholars, we're all good readers, and yet we disagree deeply about all these sorts of things. I know all your moves, you know all my moves. That's where we're at. And so the nice thing about analytic pragmatism is that it, instead of having, once you've redescribed, and this is a theme that it came up in the last one, the thought behind so many pragmatist redescriptions is that they think that they're the last description. Once you've reduced it to experience under this description, we now get to see that it was a silly one. But the thing is that another description, and especially once we've accepted the thought that there are no final vocabularies, another redescription can make certain kinds of skeptical redescriptions look very plausible and look actually quite practical. And so, in fact, the pragmatist triumphalist attitude that they've solved all the problems, or at the very least they've got a meta language that's able to identify all the worthwhile philosophical problems, and someone like Kant or someone like Plato or Aristotle muddling their stupid heads about certain kinds of pseudo problems is in some ways not just triumphalist, but in fact quite almost hubristic, is this right? The intellectual hubris of that kind of attitude is something that's in some ways just appalling and shocking. And so now, notice, by the way, that I've just used a certain kind of vocabulary to describe a philosophical program, and in a way that shows the pragmatic consequences of a certain kind of orientation. And I think, and so one of the first features of this is that metaphilosophical skepticism looks like it's something that is very friendly with pragmatist fallibilism. That, in fact, you can look at your views, and just like the academic skeptics used to say, it's Pythanon, it's something that is that looks credible to me, right? As Arcesilaus said, it's something that looks like it's credible to me, but it's not something that I think is true in any sense more than just the fact that it looks credible to me. And so as a consequence, I'm still willing to argue. I want to know all the arguments on that side. This is still the game of giving and asking for reasons, but the attitude of knowingness that seems to come along with so many of these sort of triumphalist pragmatists is something that I find I personally find appalling and offensive among intellectuals.
Roughly for pragmatist reasons, right? So think about this.
Makes them awful people. Ethical reasons.
Well, there's that, right? So imagine. So one of the clearer directives that comes out of Dewey's writings, and one of the most often cited bits from Dewey, is this very puzzling injunction, right? That comes from the Need for a Recovery of Philosophy essay about, philosophy recovers itself, Dewey says, which is what it needs to do, according to Dewey. Philosophy recovers itself when it stops attending to the problem of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers, right, for addressing the problems of men. Yeah. Now, that looks like a really nice piece of advice until you stop to think about how vacuous it is. It's like, from whence do we have the distinction between the problems of philosophers and the problems of men? That itself looks like a problem of philosophers, right? Yeah. It looks like, don't you have to do philosophy to know what the right problems are in order for philosophers to address? And moreover, the idea that there are long-standing problems of philosophers that ought to be given up and swept away like chaff, as he says, that philosophy has been mired in these kinds of disputes because philosophers haven't attended to the right method, overlooks the fact that the intractable problems of philosophy are largely problems about the method. about how to do philosophy.
That's right.
And so if we thought like, oh, gee, there's this easy answer to the question, what's the right method for addressing problems? Oh, the philosophers are stuck with the problems of philosophers because they just haven't paid attention to what's staring them right in the face, what the right method is. It's like, that's naivete.
Yeah.
That's ridiculousness.
And one last maybe apology for problems of philosophy. There are also legitimate problems in philosophy that you can get to only because of the fact that you know some philosophy, right? I mean, it looks like in order to state, you might say, certain kinds of paradoxes or something like that, you need to be able to get to them. Now, again, they're not world-shaking, and so the injunction that every work of philosophy be something that is going to change the way that some non-PhD holding in someone who doesn't hold a PhD in philosophy is going to change their life because of the consequences of your view. That seems like an absurd requirement for almost any exercise, right? It's like if we had that can't be a requirement for most conversations, right? Like that's not the problem. So any conversation about aesthetics or a conversation about how politics should run is that like trying to analyze the problem of justice or something like that? It's like I on the one hand it looks like it is a problem of men, but is it a problem of the common people? I mean, in some ways the sort of you might say the empty populism of philosophical populism of that is one that it has many interesting and you might say powerful sentiments to it, but it looks like there can be perfectly intelligible and worthwhile problems that arise that aren't ones that it looks like, yeah, it would take me a week to explain to my aunt or something like that how this problem works, because she would have to learn some modal logic, or she would need to write like I would have to lecture at this person for 3 hours for this person to just understand what the problem is, much less what one of the solutions.
Yeah,
but that doesn't make it any less of a philosophical
certainly
problem.
Doesn't prove that it's pseudo problematic. I mean,
yeah, right.
It might be like, do we have this criterion
for
maybe
math?
That's not all philosophers should be doing.
No,
is
right.
Sort of like, but who would accept that? But and by the way, how many of the 37 volumes of Dewey's collected works fail on this criterion? So okay,
yes.
we can continue in this somewhat this overtly cranky way, but.
Yeah, which one of us was more cranky? You vote in. But maybe an olive branch to the anti-analytic pragmatists, which is to say that a good deal of the anti-analytic pragmatist movement has done a handful of really nice things for analytic pragmatists, aside from just being targets for shooting practice for us. They've kept alive a certain kind of you might say underappreciated trend in the pragmatist program, and you might say it's the anti-scholastic philosophical program of trying to live by the injunction of keeping philosophy relevant to outside the academy, and that's something that I think that we should admire about them. The problem, though, and I think that this is something that we ended at one not so long ago, is that it looks like to be a good philosopher, it looks like you need to have put some time in on some non-public philosophy issues. Otherwise, everything starts looking kind of first drafty whenever it starts coming out of your mouth. Working on certain kinds of philosophical programs, the Stoics had this view too, which was learning Stoic logic is not an end in itself, but it makes you better at being able to do Stoic ethics. And so the thought is, sometimes philosophical problems are ones that are just good for you because they train you to think well and write well.
Yes. Maybe we'll go for 4. I don't know. But thank you.